The Carry On films were a series starring a regular cast of comedians joined by guests in different locations and situations. The plot always involved someone or a small group of people trying to do something worthwhile while circumstances and idiots conspired to make the whole thing a shambles. Does that sound familiar? This is a script of a reboot called Carry On Arm Wrestling, and the plot would read something like this. Two friends, let's call them Paul and Dan, both organise arm wrestling in different parts of the country. Circumstances mean that they both end up putting on an event in the same city on the same weekend. Some of the competitors Paul would like to invite are refereeing for Dan. Some people want to compete in both events, and they're not referees or even arm wrestlers, but think they could win everything based upon beer and delusion. They send messages to both declaring this. Before the event, Dan and Paul are making their plans, and other characters are gradually introduced. Two referees from the World Championship organisation are recruited to help Dan. They are small ladies, and whilst used to the strong men of continental arm wrestling, they find the island population of the UK very different. Dan puts all his information on a website, whilst Paul mainly communicates by voice or video. Dan finds that some people can't or won't read, so characters are introduced who spend their time asking questions. Most are directed to read the same information again. Paul finds that some of the people he has spoken to didn't listen, and both men talk regularly about how the same people don't seem to understand the answers, even after being told multiple times. Some who are told they won't be able to compete decide to travel and turn up anyway, hoping to be included. Three arm wrestlers travel to a venue that is not even one of the two in the story. They go to one used 3 years ago instead. The action returns to them regularly as they try to find their way by asking directions from people who have no idea where anything is. A newly formed group of arm wrestlers, who are all capable of speaking for themselves, find that the stupidest person of the group has appointed themselves leader to speak for them all. They are too polite to intervene. Whilst all this is going on, vehicles are loaded, items are dropped, broken, lost or stolen, and the telephones of Paul and Dan continually ring. Sometimes the calls have nothing to do with the competitions, just domestic utility concerns going on in the background, but mostly it is the stupid people who have already asked questions elsewhere who have called again, hoping for a different answer. There are two characters who are convinced that Paul and Dan are the same person, so they ask the wrong one questions about the other's event and don't believe the replies they get. At Dan's weigh-in, people are asked if they can weigh in late by live video link or be excused the process altogether based on imagination or an anecdote of what they weighed somewhere else at another time. Meanwhile, Paul finds that some of his competitors have decided to attend social functions instead, choosing to take their granny's hamster to the vet or such like, despite asking for a place on the show. Dan is offered a photograph of a 7-year-old boy wearing an England flag t-shirt in front of the Great Pyramid of Giza as proof of residency. All the mishaps occur one after the other, with messages being passed on phones for Dan or Paul to read, whilst they are loading equipment or setting up for the shows. Meanwhile, others ask when it is starting, when will it end, who goes first, and why isn't it me? Then the arm wrestling itself starts and provides a lot of action. Some of the wrestlers look like gorillas, whilst others resemble marathon runners. Unlikely people win and lose. Some argue with the referees. Dan argues with almost everyone. The show goes on. There are dramas, triumphs, hopes, realised and dashed. Wasps randomly attack the scoring team, and one of the scorers, let's call her Holly, proves to be the champion of swatting them. One lands on Dan's head and everyone nearby encourages to squash it with something heavy. Someone suggests that one of the larger referees, let's call him James, be found to do it. One arm wrestler fails and doesn't know why, and becomes frustrated. His family are laughing because he doesn't understand the rules. He then wins the match by a convincing pin, and when the referee calls him in to stop and shouts win, he is already convinced they are fouling him, again for no reason, so he starts to argue. It takes Dan to explain that he has won. Hand signals of W and L are introduced, so he knows whether he has won or lost for the rest of the tournament. In short, it all looks like chaos. In the background, there are extra fun matches going on where those who were seemingly unscathed by the competition performances carry on until they're exhausted or injured. Paul and his team and some of the competitors travel over to visit Dan, and more stories are told. Out in the car park, one of the competitors brings out circus dumbbells from his van and asks if anyone can lift one off the floor. James, the giant referee, who has been busy all weekend moving equipment and having challenge matches between officiating, sees them. He has had a few beers now, and it looks like his baggy shorts might fall down. Despite this, he picks both up and runs away with them. Onlookers impressed measure the distance to find he's just short of the world record. James is very pleased and is congratulated by everyone, except Holly, his wife, and Dan, who urgently calls him away from his audience for a photo back in the venue. It's all smiles at the end. Medals, belts and trophies are shown off, a million photos are taken and stories shared of the weekend's activities, and they carry on for weeks. Dan goes home, can't find his smartphone, calls the pub who search everywhere for it. He spends 10 minutes in the dark looking underneath his van with a torch for the earpiece that he dropped. Finally exhausted, he sits down to find the phone in his pocket and the earpiece on the table in front of him. His wife rolls her eyes theatrically. Elsewhere, Paul has also lost something and is trying to find it, much to the amusement of his wife. And the phones ring and ring and ring. It's dark, and we cut to a car with 3 hapless armwrestlers still driving in circles around the Birmingham ring road. One has an old map which is upside down and is actually of the M25. Another is texting Dan to get directions, whilst the other, driving with one hand, is lamenting that Paul isn't answering his phone. They can't find the NEC or Kings Heath Cricket Club, but never mind. The Pro Nationals are on in just 27 days, so once they get there, they will at least be the first to weigh in. However, they forget to put any money in the parking meter, so in 2 months' time, they will start the process of paying idiot tax instead of putting their details into the computer inside the club to park for free. The end. See you down the road.
Spoken like a true man.